She has no idea we recorded everything. That was the last thing I heard before my son's voice cut off completely. For a moment, I thought the call had dropped. Then I realized he hadn't hung up. I had. My thumb had found the red button on instinct, before my brain had even processed what my ears had just delivered to it. I sat in my truck, in the parking lot of a Canadian Tire, on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, with a bag of weather stripping on the passenger seat, and the kind of silence that only comes after something irreversible. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I'm 68 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer for the City of Edmonton, raised 2 children with my wife Patricia in a house on the south side of the river valley, and I have never once in my life considered myself a naive man. I was wrong about that. Patricia passed away 14 months before that afternoon in the parking lot. Pancreatic cancer. From diagnosis to the end was 7 weeks, long enough to say the important things, not long enough to say them all the way through. She was 64. We had talked about retirement plans that included driving the Alaska Highway in a rented RV. We had a list on the fridge. After she was gone, I stayed in the house on Canyon Road. People told me I should sell, downsize, move somewhere easier to maintain. I told them I wasn't ready. What I meant was that the house still smelled like her in certain rooms if I kept the windows closed, and I wasn't prepared to give that up yet. My son, Marcus, called every Sunday. He was 39, lived in Calgary with his wife Renata and their 8-year-old daughter, Sophie. He was a project manager at a construction firm, good at his job, confident the way men are when they've never had to rebuild themselves from zero. I was proud of him. I told Patricia that regularly, even after she couldn't hear me say it anymore. The Sunday calls had started after Patricia died. Marcus's idea. He said he didn't want me sitting alone without checking in. I told him I wasn't the type to fall apart. He said he knew that, but he wanted to call anyway. I let him, because I understood that the calls were as much for him as for me, and I wasn't going to take that from my son. Renata, I had known for 11 years. She was organized, sharp, always the one driving the schedule when they visited. Patricia had found her a little cold, once, when they were newly married. She calculates things, Patricia said, not unkindly. I'd told her that wasn't a flaw. Patricia said she knew, but that it was worth noting. Sophie was different, all warmth, no calculation, a child who still ran to hug me when they arrived and who asked me to tell her about bridges, because she knew I'd built them. She was the reason I looked forward to their visits the way I did. That November, I'd been thinking about my estate. It wasn't morbid, it was practical, the same way I'd been practical my whole career. Patricia and I had a financial advisor, a man named Clive Ostrander, who worked out of an office on White Avenue, and who had helped us build a portfolio over 30 years that I was quietly proud of. After Patricia died, the portfolio became mine alone. I also owned the house outright, bought and paid for in 2009. I had a will. It named Marcus as executor and primary beneficiary, with a portion set aside for Sophie, in a trust she could access at 25. It was clean, straightforward, the kind of document that shouldn't require much work when the time came. Marcus knew about the will, in general terms. He didn't know the specific numbers, because I'd always believed that telling your children exactly what they were going to inherit was a fast way to make them start seeing you as a problem to be managed. That was something my own father had said to me once. I should have remembered it more often. The call that afternoon hadn't been anything unusual at the start. Marcus called to ask how I was doing, whether I'd looked at the information he'd sent about a financial planning seminar in Calgary. He mentioned it casually, the way you mention something you're not sure will land. He'd been nudging me for 3 weeks about coming to visit, staying for a few days, getting some things sorted, his phrase now that a year had passed since Patricia. I told him I was managing fine. He said he knew, but that it might be useful to have fresh eyes on the portfolio. He mentioned that Renata had a friend who worked in estate planning, a woman named Dr. Sylvia Crane, who had helped several families streamline things. He said streamline the way people say it when they mean something else. I told him I'd think about it. He said that was all he was asking. We talked for another 10 minutes about Sophie's hockey and whether I was eating properly and a problem he was having with a subcontractor. Then he said he had to go. I said goodbye, and that was when it happened. The line didn't disconnect. There was a shift in the audio, the ambient sound of his kitchen, a chair scraping, and then Renata's voice, close to the phone. She has no idea we recorded everything. Marcus's response was lower, and I only caught fragments. Something about the accounts, Something about before he talks to Clive again. Then the call dropped for real. I sat with the weather stripping in my lap for a long time. The word recorded was the one that caught in my chest like a splinter. Recorded what? I hadn't said anything on that call that I wouldn't say in public. I was careful with money conversations. Always had been. I didn't discuss numbers with Marcus. Not specifically. So what had they recorded? And why did Renata think I had no idea? I drove home. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table where Patricia and I had eaten breakfast for 26 years, and I thought about the word streamline. Then I thought about the word she. Not he. Not Dad. She. I turned that over for a long time. There were two women in the relevant picture. One was Patricia, who was dead. The other was Patricia's sister, my sister-in-law Eleanor, who was 71, who lived in a small house in Spruce Grove, and who was named as a secondary beneficiary in my will to receive a modest but meaningful sum that Patricia had specifically requested be included. Eleanor and I had always gotten along well. She was sharp-tongued and funny, and had once told Marcus, when he was being difficult at a family dinner, that charm, without substance, was just weather. He had not forgotten it. I called Eleanor the next morning. She answered on the second ring, which was normal, and she sounded fine, which was also normal. We talked for a while, about nothing important, before I asked her, as carefully as I could, whether Marcus or Renata had been in touch with her recently. There was a pause. Marcus called me about 2 weeks ago, she said. He asked me some questions about your financial situation. I told him I didn't know your financial situation. He seemed surprised by that. What kind of questions? He wanted to know if you'd updated your will after Patricia, whether you'd mentioned making any changes, whether I'd noticed anything. She paused, choosing the word unusual about your judgment lately. The last part landed like cold water. He asked about my judgment. He framed it as concern, Eleanor said. He said he'd noticed you were more forgetful than usual, that he was worried. He mentioned the word capacity in passing, he said, like he was just thinking out loud. I thanked Eleanor. I told her not to say anything to Marcus about our conversation. She said she wouldn't, and then she said, in the voice she used when she wasn't going to say something twice, Gerald, be careful. I was already being careful. I just hadn't known yet what I was being careful about. That evening, I called Clive Ostrander. He picked up from home, which he always did for clients of long standing, and I asked him whether anyone had contacted his office recently regarding my accounts. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yes, a woman had called 3 days earlier, identifying herself as a licensed estate planner, acting on behalf of my family, asking about the process for updating beneficiary designations and whether the accounts were structured in a way that would require probate. She had not given her full name. She had given a firm name that Clive had not recognized and had not been able to verify when he looked it up afterward. He had told her that he could not discuss my accounts with a third party and that if I wanted to make changes, I would need to initiate that process directly. He had meant to call me, he said. He was sorry he hadn't yet. I told him not to make any changes to anything, regardless of who called or what they said or how they framed the request. I told him that if anyone contacted him again, I wanted to know immediately, and I wanted him to keep a written record of it. He said he understood, and his voice had a quality in it that told me he understood more than I'd said. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was panicking, panic had never been my operating mode, but because I was working. 31 years of engineering had taught me that before you can fix a structural problem, you need to understand exactly where the load is being applied and where the failure point is. I spent those hours mapping what I knew, what I suspected, and what I needed to confirm. By 5 in the morning, I had a list. I called my lawyer, a woman named Janet Cook, who had handled the estate when Patricia passed, and I made an appointment for the following week. I didn't tell her everything on the phone. I told her I wanted to review my estate documents and make some adjustments. Then I bought a small digital recorder from a shop on Jasper Avenue, the kind that fits in a shirt pocket and runs for 40 hours on a single charge. I had used one in the field, years ago, for site notes. I remembered how to use it. I called Marcus on Sunday as usual. I told him I'd been thinking about his suggestion and that I was open to coming to Calgary. I said I thought he was right, that it made sense to get things organized. I used the word streamline back at him and listened to the slight shift in his voice when I did something that might have been relief or satisfaction or both. He said he was glad. He said Renata would be happy to hear it. He said Dr. Crane had an opening on the second Saturday of December, if that worked. I said that worked perfectly. I arrived in Calgary on a Friday evening, 3 weeks after the parking lot. Marcus picked me up from the airport. He was attentive, carried my bag, asked about the drive-in without a layover, bought me dinner at a steakhouse near his house. He was the version of himself that he showed to people he was trying to reassure. I knew that version. I had watched him deploy it at job interviews and family gatherings his whole adult life. It was effective. Renata was warm at dinner, warmer than usual, the kind of warm that requires effort. Sophie sat beside me and told me about a project she was building at school, a model of a suspension bridge. She said, because of me. I helped her think through the cable angles after dinner, while Marcus and Renata cleaned up and spoke quietly to each other in the kitchen. That night, I lay in their guest room, and I could hear the murmur of their voices through the wall. I couldn't make out words. I didn't need to. The recorder was on the nightstand, and I had already sent copies of everything I'd documented so far to Janet Cook's email, along with a note explaining what I believed was happening and what I intended to find out on Saturday. Janet had called me back within an hour of receiving it. Her voice was measured, but her questions were sharp. She asked me to keep records of everything and to contact her immediately after the Saturday meeting. She also told me that what I was describing, if accurate, had a name under Alberta law. Several names, in fact. On Saturday morning, Marcus drove me to an office building in the northwest part of the city. It was a nice building, not ostentatious, but the kind of address that was meant to signal stability. The office inside was similarly calibrated. Solid furniture, framed certificates on the wall, a reception desk staffed by a young woman who offered us water and said, Dr. Crane would be right with us. Dr. Sylvia Crane was about 50, well-dressed, with the kind of practiced calm that either means deep competence or deep performance. She shook my hand and said she'd heard a great deal about me from Marcus, which was the first thing she said that told me something useful. Marcus had been talking to her before today. This was not an introductory meeting. She walked me through what she described as an estate optimization review, a process, she said, that many families found useful at transitional stages of life. She used that phrase twice. She had a document on the desk in front of her, already partially filled out, that she said was a preliminary overview of what a restructured plan might look like for someone in my situation. She knew the approximate value of my house. She knew I had investment accounts. She did not know the specific figures, because Clive had given her nothing, but she had estimates that were close enough to tell me she'd been gathering information from somewhere. I let her talk. I asked questions that sounded like the questions of a man who was following carefully and feeling slightly overwhelmed. I mentioned Patricia twice, let my voice go quiet in the way that was true and that I knew would register as vulnerability. The recorder in my shirt pocket ran quietly throughout. When she placed the first document in front of me, I read it fully. She waited with the patience of someone who has learned not to rush the moment. It was a power of attorney, not a financial power of attorney limited to specific assets. A broad, general power of attorney that would give Marcus authority over substantially all of my financial decisions, framed in the document as a coordinated family estate management instrument language I had never seen in any legitimate legal document in my 30 years of dealing with contracts. I looked up at her. I'd like to take this home and have my lawyer review it before I sign anything, I said. Something moved across her face. It was fast, and she covered it well, but I had spent 3 decades reading the faces of people in meetings when they heard something they hadn't planned for. Of course, she said, smoothly. That's completely reasonable. We can schedule a follow-up. Marcus had gone quiet beside me in a way that was different from his usual quiet. I folded the document, put it in my jacket pocket, and said I thought that was probably enough for one day. In the car on the way back, Marcus was careful and pleasant, and said almost nothing of substance. I matched him. We stopped for coffee. He paid. I thanked him. That evening, while he and Renata were putting Sophie to bed, I sat in the guest room and called Janet. She listened to everything, including the relevant portions of the recording I read back to her from memory. She told me to bring the document home with me. She told me she had already, based on my earlier notes, begun making inquiries about Dr. Sylvia Crane. Sylvia Crane was not a licensed estate planner in Alberta. She held a certificate in financial counseling from an institution in British Columbia that Janet described, with careful precision, as not a recognized accrediting body. There were 2 complaints on file with the Alberta Securities Commission involving her name and a firm that had since dissolved. She was not, as far as Janet could determine, a doctor of anything. I flew home on Sunday morning. Marcus hugged me at the airport and told me he was glad I'd come. I told him I was glad too. Sophie ran back to hug me a second time before I went through security. She whispered that she had fixed the cable angles on her bridge model and that it was much better now. I told her I'd known she would figure it out. Over the following 6 weeks, Janet did the things that lawyers do when they are good at their jobs and have been given something real to work with. She filed a complaint with the Alberta Securities Commission. She contacted the Law Society regarding the conduct of a notary whose name appeared on Sylvia Crane's documents. She documented the recorded conversation at Clive's office and the phone call to Eleanor and the sequence of questions Marcus had asked about my capacity. I updated my will. The update was specific and thorough and was witnessed by 2 people who were not my son. I restructured 2 of my accounts so that any change to beneficiary designations required written notice to both Clive and Janet before taking effect. I added Eleanor as a co-executor because she was steady and because she had told me to be careful before anyone else had. I did not confront Marcus directly. That was Janet's advice, and it was also my own instinct. I understood, from long experience, that the most important structural reinforcements are the ones that are in place before the load is applied, not after. In February, Marcus called on a Sunday as usual. He mentioned, carefully, that Dr. Crane had apparently had some professional difficulties and that the follow-up meeting he'd been hoping to arrange might not be possible after that. He framed it as an unfortunate inconvenience. He asked if I wanted him to look for someone else. I told him that I'd already taken care of things on my end, and that I was happy with where everything stood. There was a pause on the line. "Oh," he said. "Good. How's Sophie?" I asked. "She's good," he said. "She wants to tell you about the bridge." "Put her on," I said. Sophie talked for 20 minutes about load distribution and anchor points. I sat in the kitchen on Canyon Road and listened to every word. In March, the Alberta Securities Commission formally concluded its investigation. Sylvia Crane was prohibited from offering financial services in the province. 2 other families she had worked with came forward during the process. The notary received a reprimand and a period of supervised practice. Marcus was not charged with anything. What he had done, the questions to Eleanor, the call to Clive, the arrangement of the meeting existed in a legal space that was difficult to prosecute absent a completed transaction. Janet told me this plainly, and I told her I understood. What I had was something harder to take away than a legal outcome. I had clarity. I know now that the Sunday calls, which I had believed were for both of us, were partly something else. I know that the concern about my capacity was not concern. I know that Renata's calculative quality, which Patricia had noted 11 years earlier, and which I had defended as a neutral trait, is not neutral when it is applied to the man whose estate your husband expects to inherit. I know these things, and I carry them the way you carry a load-bearing change to a structure carefully, with full awareness of what it means for everything built around it. I still answer the Sunday calls. I listen more carefully than I used to. Sophie has told me she wants to be an engineer. I told her that was an excellent choice, and that the most important thing any engineer learns is that what looks solid from the outside is not always solid where it counts, and that your job is to find the difference. She said she would remember that. I believe her. If you are getting older and you have assets that matter and people around you who know it, please have a lawyer you trust and keep your own counsel on the details. Have your accounts structured so that changes require more than one signature. Know who has copies of your documents, and make sure at least one of them has no stake in your estate. These are not cynical precautions. They are the same precautions you would take with any structure you expected to last. And if someone ever uses the word streamline in a conversation about your finances, put your pen down and call your lawyer before you pick it up again. Patricia would have caught it sooner than I did. She was better at people than I was, but I caught it. And sometimes catching it later is enough, as long as you catch it before the last thing is signed and the line finally goes dead.